Welcome, everyone. Thank you to all of you that have introduced yourself in the chat. So glad you could join us today. We're thrilled that you're here. Welcome to OE 101 session 3. Today, we'll be diving into open in the current moment, open education in the current moment. My name is Christina Riemann Murphy, and I'm a visiting program officer for open education leadership at Spark and an open education librarian at Penn State. And I will be introducing our guest speakers shortly, who you can see in the window. On behalf of Spark, I want to welcome everyone joining us and set the context for this series and this session in particular. In 2024, Spark introduced the Open Access 101 series, driven by Nick Shockey, Maria Bond, Josh Bollock, and Will Cross, who is joining us today. And we had great feedback on that series, and so we were inspired to launch Open Education 101, and we're thrilled by the interest we've had for this one. As you can see, we're using the webinar format. So please use the chat to introduce yourself, share resources, and interact with other attendees. But if you have questions for any of the panelists, please use the Q&A feature. We will try to answer as many of them live or in the Q&A as we can. But we want to let you know that the fourth session in the series will be solely focused on answering the common questions that have arisen from attendees throughout the whole series. So we'll also have a Padlet, which we're going to share the link to in the chat, where you could add any questions throughout this session today or ongoing. You'll have the link that have come up for you throughout the series. So I also want to note that all participants who registered will receive a copy of the slide deck with notes and links when we send out the recording, which will also be posted to Spark's Open Education 101 series page as well. So you're welcome to take notes, but just know you don't need to. So this is the 4-part series. Today is about open education in the current moment, and we'll dive into some of the big challenges and opportunities that are currently facing the field. And as I mentioned earlier, the 4th session will address some of the common questions. If you haven't registered for the upcoming session yet, the link is in the chat. Gabby will put it there in a moment. Thank you, Gabby. And if you wanted to watch any of the other recordings, you can go to the Spark Open Education 101 page as well to watch them. So I'm thrilled to announce today that our presenters will be Nicole Allen, Director of Open Education at Spark, Will Cross, Director of the Open Knowledge Center and Head of Information Policy at NC State University Libraries, and Brad Griffith, Senior Director of Academic Pathways and Innovation for the Colorado Department of Higher Education. So thank you to all of us for joining today. Before I turn it over to them, I just want to go over some of the assumptions that we came with in developing this series. If you've attended before, you may have heard these already, but we really want to acknowledge what we came with when we put the series together. So this is a very high-level overview of open education for librarians, instructional designers, faculty, administrators, and educators. Our goal is literacy and awareness, not fluency, just because of the time limit. And we know there's a wide range of experiences among our attendees today. And while Nicole, Will, and Brad's backgrounds and institutional experiences influence us, we've really tried to approach this session with broad context in mind. And we also want to acknowledge that some of the things we're talking about in this series, in this session, are debated and contested, which is wonderful. Ultimately, we believe that open education is a good thing, but we know it is an imperative that it be critiqued. So just briefly, session 1, we went over the foundations of open education and some of the things that you can see here. In session 2, we got into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty, open education in practice at the institutional, state, and individual level. And today we're going to be talking about the following learning objectives. Nicole is going to be going over how open education intersects with current trends and challenges, and she'll be articulating strategic responses to course billing models. Will is going to explore artificial intelligence's impact on open education. Brad will align or talk about how open education aligns with emerging priorities such as workforce readiness, skills, and credentials. And finally, Nicole is going to close us out by talking about how to develop advocacy strategies and positioning for integrating open education into broader institutional initiatives and priorities. So now I'm going to turn it over to Nicole to get us started.
Thanks so much, Christina. Great to be here. So as you shared thus far in the series, we've talked about sort of the nuts and bolts of open education and open education in practice. And today we're going to be putting this all into context in the current moment we are in. We like to say often that open education itself is not a goal. It is a tool and an enabling strategy to achieve broader goals and to be a solution that needs to meet the current moment. And it is quite a moment we are in. Higher education is in flux with rapid changes. I obviously want to acknowledge the broader changes that are impacting education, particularly here in the US, with policy changes and funding cuts at the federal and state levels that have really a profound impact on the way we work and on people both personally and professionally. There's also a swirl of new priorities and changes in the marketplace and in the technologies we're using that impact institutional priorities and leaders, as well as introducing new areas of focus and priorities. And the pressures we're seeing are both external and internal. External pressures include things like the growth of automatic textbook billing in the course material environment. So that's an ongoing challenge that provides sort of limits to the opportunity that open education presents at institutions. There's also, and I'm going to be talking a little bit more about that in a minute, there's also artificial intelligence, which has become a pressing priority across our educational systems within policy conversations. And it's something that open education really needs to adapt to and learn how to relate to. And Will's going to be talking more about that. And then there are also internal pressures as institutions do change their priorities in response to the environment. And Brad will talk more about the opportunities that can present in terms of workforce education and different types of credentialing that open education can intersect with. But I think in the bigger picture, open education is sort of at a crossroads. We've talked a bit about how it's developed as a movement, taking ideas of longstanding ideas and new ideas about introducing knowledge sharing and co-creation and more open ways of shaping knowledge together into the way that we practice education. But to stay relevant, open education really needs to meet the moment and find ways to strategically position it as a solution. So open education can't just be about the applying these ideas. It needs to be put in the context of the challenges that we're facing. And we're hoping that through the conversation today, we can offer you some ideas of how you can actually go back to your campus and apply this. So I'm going to move on to talking about the first area of focus, which is automatic textbook billing. And this is to talk about a challenge that we are facing right now. So the open education movement, at least in US higher education, has its roots in or it gained its popularity in response to the rising cost of college textbooks. So, which that has been a problem that students have been facing for decades. Over the first decade of the 2000s, there was a trend of students increasingly not buying their textbooks, the textbook industry losing sales to the secondary market, and the increasing adoption of OER actually put a lot of pressure onto textbook companies, bookstores, textbook publishers, and sort of push them to change their practices. And actually, a change in federal regulations here in the US in 2016 opened the door to a new model where these companies could partner with institutions to essentially automatically charge students for course materials. And since then, the textbook industry has sort of widely pushed for institutions to switch to automatic textbook billing models, marketing this as a solution to those affordability challenges that the industry itself created. And that's changed the advocacy environment that the open education movement has been within, because originally we were just talking about open educational resources as an alternative to expensive traditional textbooks. And now we're talking about it as in comparison to these new textbook billing models that are promoted as a solution. So before going further, I want to just take a minute to define what automatic textbook billing is, because it uses lots of different names on lots of different campuses. But at its core, this is a sales model that adds the cost of textbooks and other course materials directly into students' tuition and fees. It's set up as a partnership between the institution and typically it's a bookstore and publishers. The digital content students have been assigned from those publishers is delivered to students by the first day of class, and they have a short period to opt out of being billed for it before the cost is added to their student account and they have to pay for it. And since we're talking about digital materials, often the access is going to expire at the end of the course, or if they're print materials, it's typically on a rental basis. So if this doesn't sound familiar so far, you might have heard the term inclusive access as the most common overarching term that's used to describe this. Also, equitable access is another term that's used, but it goes by many local names. Some of the main vendors that push for this are the bookstore operating chains, Barnes and Noble and Follett, also Vital Source and major publishers like Cengage, Pearson, McGraw-Hill. They all have their own names: First Day Complete, Follett Access. You may have heard, some of these terms. So, as I said before, these models actually sound in many ways like OER or can be made to sound like OER. And when you put them side by side, though, it's pretty easy to spot the differences. So both of these models are promoted as a way to reduce the cost of course materials. They're promoted as a way to provide digital access. But there's some big differences. With automatic textbook billing or inclusive or equitable access, we're talking about limited digital access that's billed to students unless they opt out. But with OER, we're talking about barrier-free digital access to openly licensed materials that's available on day one at no cost to students, and there's never a charge for it. With both models, students can sometimes get access to print copies, but with automatic textbook billing, it's often at an additional cost on top of what they've already paid for, whereas with OER, students have the legal permission to simply print out pages if they want, or can get a low-cost print copy if desired, but they don't have to pay for anything if they don't want to. With automatic billing, we're typically talking about materials that expire at the end of the course and students can't retain or reference later, but with OER, students can retain access forever, reference it in the future, and don't have to worry about losing access. And then finally, with automatic billing, we're talking about the same old traditionally copyrighted course materials that we've always used, just billed in a different way. Whereas with OER, we're talking about openly licensed materials that are not just openly licensed for students to use, but so that faculty can adapt materials to local needs, engage in open pedagogy, and be able to make those materials just better and more relevant to the students of today. So big differences. And these are some of the things that you can point out in terms of communicating these differences. Moving on. I do want to note that automatic textbook billing is implemented in two main ways. The first and most common and sort of traditional model of textbook billing is a course by course model, or what's often called inclusive access, where faculty basically decide whether, or sometimes the bookstore decides whether their course is enrolling in inclusive access or not, and whether their students are going to get automatically billed or not. And if the faculty doesn't want their course to be part of it, it doesn't have to be. And students in that model get billed for the actual cost of the course materials they've been assigned, and only for the participating courses. So if there's a course using OER, students aren't going to get billed. And then the opt-out process is on a course-by-course basis. So under federal regulations, students have to be allowed to opt out, and students can simply opt out of the courses that they don't want to be billed for. The other model is a flat fee or so-called equitable access model, where all faculty, students, and courses are automatically opted into this and part of it, whether they want to be or not. And students are billed a flat fee regardless of the actual cost of their materials. It's usually calculated per semester or credit hour. So, a lot of the programs that I've seen bill at $20 to $25 per credit hour, which usually works out to $60 to $75 per course, or $600 to $750 a year. And that opt-out is typically all or nothing. So if you have to stay opted in for one of your courses, that you have to stay in for all of them. And then if you are using OER in a course, you're going to get billed the same $60 to $75 as a student in a course with an expensive material. So moving on to some of the challenges that these models present. So first, the discounts are often based, that are advertised are often based on print prices and are actually much smaller when they're calculated apples to apples with digital prices. A lot of the contracts that we've seen offer a discount of like 20% or less. With the flat fee or equitable access models, actually students, those annual prices of $600 to $750 is actually more than double, in some cases, what the National Association of College Stores says students spend on average for course materials. So I think there's just like a lot of scrutiny that we need to do on the prices these programs are charging. And that's especially true on campuses that use a lot of OER or free materials, that those materials, that students are getting billed for materials that are actually free. Like, where is that money going? There are also a lot of challenges around the opt-out process. A lot of times this can be difficult for students, especially first generation students or students that are part-time or working and just don't have time to figure out how to navigate the system or understand really the implications of the fees that are going to get charged. And a lot of times students can get them cheaper as used books or rentals, and you're making the students who need those savings the most jump through those hoops. There's the issue that students aren't able to really own the content. It's temporary, they can't keep it. And there are also long-term concerns about, increasing the control at the bookstore or administrative level can really put pressure on faculty, in terms of the types of materials they're using. And there's not a lot of price checks built into a lot of the contracts that we've seen. So we sort of know historically which direction textbook prices go over time, and that is up. And without meaningful cost controls in these contracts, the handwriting is sort of on the wall in the long term that this is taking an already captive market where, students don't have choice about what materials they buy for their courses and making it even more captive. We sort of know where this is headed long term, and that's toward runaway prices. And I think its institutions really need to be concerned about that. So the final thing I want to say is just leave you with some things that you can do. So first, just be proactive. Make sure your administrators, faculty, students are aware of OER initiatives and how that can be better. Ask questions, thoroughly examine the legal, financial, ethical implications of this model and why open can be a better solution. Be rigorous in your analysis of vendor changes and keep the focus on students. Put student needs and voices at the center of the conversation. It's clear how these models benefit textbook vendors, but we should really be thinking about what benefits students. And then to the extent your campus is moving to a flat fee program, really fight to exempt courses that use free or open materials from being charged that flat fee to defend the progress that you've made on affordability. So if you'd like to learn more about this issue, on the next slide is a list of questions that you can ask. And if you visit the website inclusiveaccess.org on the screen, and that will also be put in the chat, you can find other resources for advocacy and lists of questions that you can ask of stakeholders on campus about these models and really work to navigate sort of this crossroads we're at where course material models are headed on many campuses in this direction where things are being locked down, when we really should be thinking about how can we make them more open. So with that, I will turn things back to Christina to introduce Will. Or
Okay,
directly
well,
to Will.
I'll get right to Will. Oh, go ahead, Will.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Nicole. And thanks everybody for joining us. I wanted to note that the chat has been super active with really good information and some emails have been sent about partnerships and sharing information. Please keep doing that. That's super valuable and super important, I think. So thank you everybody for being here for this discussion. You probably don't need me to say that AI is everywhere right now. It's been at the heart of some of the big conversations in open education right now. There's a ton here. So what I thought we would do is to sketch out the issues at a high level in the slides and then drill down some in the Q&A now and then on the next call as well. So on the next slide, I think we acknowledge the fact that AI is not new. It's been around for a while, but it's taken some really important leaps technologically and culturally in the past couple of years. So a lot of institutions, probably including yours, are working to figure out how AI fits in with their open education strategy. UNESCO called this out explicitly in their recent Dubai Declaration. Funders and donors care a lot about this stuff. And there has been a ton of social and cultural pressure just to have a take. Like, what do you think about this thing? And I think that pressure has been felt especially deeply in the open education community, with some folks going all in on AI as the future of open in the same way that like network technology and the World Wide Web was transformative in the late 90s and early 2000s, and others just decrying AI as a massive scam and a huge waste of time, kind of like maybe the way some people would view NFTs a few years ago. But on the next slide, I want to suggest that AI is probably neither of those extremes, and that some of that overheated invective is driven by the fact that the term AI has become kind of a free-floating buzzword that means everything and nothing, or whatever you're feeling, big mad about today. So to pin it down a bit, we borrowed the wiki definition and have that here. But I want even this definition that we've picked to resist a little bit some of that anthropomorphic language about AI learning or reasoning. People will say AI is hallucinating, etc. AI, of course, isn't a human being that thinks and feels and learns. AI is nothing more or less than a set of computational tools that honestly run the gamut from really quotidian things like autocomplete that you see in email or the minor correction tools that you have in Photoshop to, at the other sort of end of the spectrum, large language models that can generate sophisticated new works. So when we talk about AI today in this conversation, I think we're going to focus in particular on generative AI, which is AI that generates new works based on patterns in existing data. So let's sort of focus on that definition of AI for now. As this next slide, no, please go on. Thank you. You're doing exactly the right thing. As a tool, AI has some well-observed strengths and weaknesses. AI is really good at making things that are pretty good very quickly. And that has been really useful for folks who want to engage in a lot of the labor-intensive tasks in open education that have been stumbling blocks for a long time, like generating large bodies of descriptive text, translation, generating alt text and images, and that sort of thing. At the same time, AI has a tendency to output at least imperfect and often totally inaccurate information. And like any tool, AI can reproduce existing biases and inequities, has an environmental component that you have to think about. And I'll also say that there has been a lot of sound and fury about AI and copyright. As the resident copyright nerd, I am happy to get exercised about copyright. But I do think that a lot of that angst is sort of orthogonal to the conversations about pedagogy that we're especially well situated to address. So I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A as well. But for now, why don't we take another sort of lens on AI, what it is and is not good for in the next slide. Over the past year or so, I've been working with a friend and colleague named Meredith Jacob to talk to educators about how they see AI fitting in with education as an enterprise. We've done a series of focus groups, and we've heard some of the things that are in line with the strengths and weaknesses mentioned on the previous slide. I think there's a general consensus that AI is a really good process tool, but it is not a substitute for subject matter expertise. So if you know the area that you're building something in and you just want a labor-saving device, AI is really good for that. But if you're somebody who's new to a field, who doesn't necessarily know what's happening, and you just sort of hope that AI can be a magic answer machine, you're going to have a bad time. Likewise, there is a broad consensus in education that AI really needs transparency and attribution built into it. We should be transparent about when and how we're using these new tools that we're sort of figuring out together. And there has been some great discussion, including a link in the chat, thank you, Gabby, for adding that, about bringing better attribution standards to artificial intelligence. It's also the case that AI is a tool that requires skill to use well, like any other, right? If you put somebody behind the wheel of a car who had never driven a car before and didn't know how traffic signals worked or what a speed limit was, they would get into trouble fairly quickly. And the same thing is true with AI. If you approach it uncritically, it often will do more harm than good. So there's real value in critical use of AI and in use of AI that helps people really understand it's pretty good for this, it's pretty bad for that, and demystifies it in different ways. And then finally, this is my soapbox. I think AI has a lot of potential to be kind of a detector for crappy disposable assignments. That when you see repeated use by students of AI in ways that feel unexpected or troublesome, often that's an indicator that this assignment either is or at least feels like a waste of time to a lot of students. And so I think AI can be a great opportunity to be an engine for renewable assignments and open pedagogy and the stuff that we think about a lot. So that's sort of the view from the educators that I've spoken with and from my own work that I've done. Having presented that, why don't we look at some examples starting on the next slide of how individual open education programs are using generative AI in particular right now. First, a lot of folks are using Gen AI to make new material like textbooks, right? If you want to make an open textbook, AI can be really helpful. Gabby is dropping into chat some of the work that they've done at Johns Hopkins recently, where they have taken a subject matter expertise who is still at the center, and then that expert has used Gen AI to build out from the core of the textbook those ancillaries that can be challenging to develop at times, as well as some supporting pieces such as forwards, summaries, that sort of thing as well. So thank you for sharing those examples around building open educational resources. On the next slide, I've been really impressed by the folks at Kennesaw State and what they have been doing with something called retrieval augmented generation, or RAGs, these are sometimes called, to connect students with specific resources and to support more open and engaged pedagogies. Again, there's some great links in chat here to some of the things that they're doing. In particular, I want to direct you to the work they're doing with the Atlanta Student Movement Project, which is a collection in their archives focused on student advocacy during the civil rights movement. This is a collection that's super important and unique and local and really interesting, but could be obscure and hard to connect students with. And so they've done some great things using RAGs to connect students to assignments that are more authentic, that are more relevant, that are more localized and tailored, and that sort of thing. So I've really admired what they've done there. And then on the third slide, I want to share a different approach as well, which is our friends at Open Oregon, who have taken a sort of pause on artificial intelligence. They did some initial investigation. They said, I want to know what this is and I want to understand it. And then they decided that this is not the right tool for the work that we're doing at this moment. So we're going to set it aside. We're going to watch how it develops and sort of see where it goes from there. And I think that's a valid and wonderful and thoughtful way to engage with AI, just as Kennesaw State and Johns Hopkins are doing. So on the last slide, just to say there's no right way for your open education program to engage with AI. But to do that meeting the moment thing that we talked about at the beginning of the session here, I want to finish by pointing out a report that is so hot off the presses. I think it's going to come out next week, but it's from the Driving OER Sustainability for Student Success, or DOORS Collaborative. That's a group of public higher education systems and organizations that are committed to supporting student success by promoting open education. They, and I've been part of this group, have been having discussions and focus groups with open educators specifically to see what they're doing in terms of building the context for meeting the moment and making meaning around generative artificial intelligence. The whole report is great, and I commend it to you, despite the fact that I participated in it. But I wanted to finish with these four sort of high-level four North Stars, maybe in a constellation, the four things to think about as you're deciding what your engagement with artificial intelligence and Gen AI in particular will look like. Briefly, I think centering students is something Nicole spoke about in a really thoughtful and powerful way, that when we make decisions about any tool, including these new tools, evaluate that not through your own preconceived assumptions or your feelings about technology or your need to feel like you're being innovative or anything else. Start with the students and really center their experiences and outcomes. We advocate for an approach that we call AI critical pragmatism, which is a recognition that these tools, like any tools, exist within a larger educational context. They're not a panacea that's going to solve all the world's problems. They're not a blight that's going to bring about the apocalypse. They're a thing that needs to be understood as something that might or might not fit into the larger systems and structures that we exist within. We also advise, and I think this is really important, that policy should follow pedagogy. So again, start with what's the pedagogical outcome you want to see, and then see how the tools do or do not slot in. Don't sort of use the tool first approach. And then finally, making a lot of space for, particularly for vulnerable students and vulnerable learners, to figure out for themselves on their own terms what's right for them, and then learn from that to build the best policies for everyone else. That's a lesson we've taken from the accessibility community. It's been really, really important there, and I think it's really, really important here. So I could talk your ear off all day about this stuff, but I hope that's enough of a sort of a context for us to have a good conversation going forward. Now I'm super excited to pass the baton over to Jeff, who's going to talk about another area that's really, really important and might be related in some ways to this artificial intelligence discussion. So Jeff, please take it away.
Sorry, Will. It's Brad, but Jeff has a
Brad, I'm
question
so
for you.
sorry. I saw
No,
Jeff in the chat and I got that.
Jeff has a,
Brad
I was gonna
Griffith, I'm
say,
so sorry.
Jeff has a
You
question
can
for you in
call
the
me,
chat.
you can call
So
me something else if you
all
I'm
good.
very
Thanks, Brad.
fortunate that I have a doppelganger within the open education world that I can blame all of my faults on. So his name is Jeff Gallant, and he works at the University System of Georgia. Fantastic person, and actually our current chair of doers. And hi everyone, my name is Brad Griffith, and I come to you from Colorado. I actually have been working at the Colorado Department of Higher Education for about 5 months now, and transitioned here from working in the state of Oklahoma at the State Higher Ed Executive Office there. And I'm very excited to share with you all a little bit about my perspective and just my understanding, to be honest with you, on this space of workforce readiness, micro-credentials, and also fill you in on some of what we're trying to explore within open education and the areas where I'm able to intersect. In addition to my role at the Colorado Department of Higher Education, I've had the privilege for the past 2 years of serving as the Innovation Work Group Chair for the Doers Group that Will talked about in his slides previously. So there is a group of individuals out there that work at the state and system level. We have a lot of good representation across the US as well as Canada. But there are people out there that are really trying to figure out, especially between these topics that have emerged of AI and workforce readiness, where does open fit within this equation, and how might we be able to make a case for it if that's not already happening from where you sit, whether that be at a program or institution level, or maybe if you're actually participating in some advocacy at the regional or state level, again, from wherever you might sit there. So go ahead, Christina. So for those of you that are on the call who might have heard this term repeatedly, but may not actually understand or have really thought about how to articulate it, I wanted to do a little bit of an outline for you all of what workforce readiness is, specifically with regard to it being an emerging opportunity, and putting some definitions on some of these terms that you might have actually heard over time here. So a couple of the key changes that you might hear about on the national landscape, or perhaps even within your own state right now, I wanted to describe for you here. So number one is a specific change that has come about and has evolved, I would say, over the past couple of years with respect to financial aid opportunities for these short-term or non-degree credential type programs. You saw that we're going to use the term micro-credential, but as you'll see on an upcoming slide, there are a number of different terms that you'll see floating around out there. But the important thing to know is that the federal government, as well as state governments, have made shifts to increase the eligibility of these kinds of programs for federal funding sources. And that's a big shift for us that have been working within the program development and design world over a number of years. Especially those of you who might have worked in continuing education offices, for example, to know these kinds of programs that might be a little bit more iterative are actually becoming eligible for some of these traditional sources of funding. States have also been retooling and refocusing at length on workforce development through key initiatives. Colorado's governor, for example, Governor Jared Polis, released an executive order back in May that essentially restructured and realigned many of the educational and economic development resources across the state, with some charges that we explored new territories in order to define how do we actually get Coloradans into viable job opportunities with very rapid and applicable training opportunities that have been assessed for quality. So again, an all hands on deck executive order can be quite a motivating factor whenever you're trying to inject something new into a conversation. Alternative credential models have also grown substantially. I came into this space working at a regional university in Oklahoma around 2015. And at that time, I was hearing terms like nano credentials or nano degrees thrown around. Micro credentials had started popping up there, but none of this had been codified at that point. A lot of it was exploratory. I can tell you all that there was a big kind of crux within our identification when I was working in Oklahoma with the onslaught of the COVID-19 pandemic, of this becoming something that was actually systemized at the state level, and we realized had longevity and actual benefit for our state beyond just the pandemic. So I encourage you to kind of think about that construct that we were all in at that time of March of 2020, where everybody in your social circle had lost their job and was looking for an opportunity to reskill, perhaps in an area where they had never encountered before because there were job opportunities available. That was a sweet spot for alternative credentials to be able to take off at institutions and also within states like Oklahoma, which at the time dedicated over $1.5 million of funding, which has been sustained year over year since then, for institutions to be able to develop those programs and to scholarship students who are going to enroll in them. This has also enabled a whole different kind of spectrum, especially within academic programs. And I do want to draw a distinction, especially with the kind of industry partnership and caliber of that has historically taken place between career and technical education programs and academic programs. So this kind of micro-credentialing structure really forces these traditional liberal arts disciplines to come to the table and ask, how is what we're teaching in the classroom here contributing towards these workforce outcomes that are being set by other organizations at the state level, or potentially legislative bodies as well, who are passing bills all the time that create incentives and create goals, strategic outcomes that states are supposed to reach. One of the things that you can always watch out for in this space and have been able to for quite some time is the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or WIOA. So this has been the large kind of conduit for federal workforce funding being issued to states and is usually managed by a singular statewide authority. So I know in the case of Oklahoma, for example, it had been Oklahoma Works that was the manager of these funds. These things are in shift a little bit right now. States are starting to ask the question of, are we deploying these funds to the most appropriate and effective agency or office possible? What if we might end up spreading funds across an agency or multiple agencies? What if we ended up creating a new agency that brought together elements of some of these existing structures to create something that's new and innovative? So innovation is certainly afoot within this space, which I think sets a prime stage for open education to really ask itself, how is it that we fit? How can we come to the table and actually propose that we have value and can really be a game changer with some of these conversations happening between educational institutions, industry partners, and the learners and earners, workers that we're trying to serve there? So delving a little bit more as you kind of dig into this workforce readiness term, a couple of things to plant in your ear here. So we're really talking about specific alignment between education and employer needs. There is a perception gap that exists, I think, among legislators as well as employers about what higher education is able to do for society and how we're actually preparing workers. And these kinds of programs, especially with micro-credentials that are short-term and iterative, really have provide an opportunity, I think, for us to reset that landscape. So you will often hear within this space this notion of skills-based or competency-focused development opportunities. So there's a sort of translation that actually has to happen whenever you're navigating this space between the learning outcomes or objectives that we're used to working with as academic professionals, faculty members, and the KSAs, or knowledge, skills, and abilities that employers use commonly as their language. So these are the terms that you'll frequently see popping up on job applications, for example, the terms that are being plugged into human resources information systems. So you want to ask yourself, how are these terms actually kind of crosswalked back and forth? Are employers actually able to understand, for example, the jargon that we sometimes use in the classroom or when we're talking about the development of these individuals? We're also being asked all the time to question this integration of the workforce ecosystem with higher education. So, where and when does higher education actually fit into the workforce development experience of an individual? And I say this kind of is just a generalization on this call. I think many of you included in this grew up with this kind of model that you followed of I complete a higher education credential, whether that's an associate or a bachelor's degree. I go out and maybe work a few years, or maybe I go directly into graduate school. If I have worked a few years, maybe I do end up returning and get a master's degree at some point because I want to keep advancing in my profession. That is just not the reality that many learners or employers are encountering today. And I just can't emphasize that enough. Higher ed is essentially turning into this revolving door for many individuals where they may start and stop occasionally on that progress towards a degree because they have goals that they want to accomplish, whether financially or otherwise in their life. But we have to start recognizing this kind of incremental learning opportunity that occurs aside of just this simple 2 and 4 year or graduate degree program structure that's in place here. And again, for those people in particular who might not be at the point where they're able to finish a degree, within one fell swoop, what are we giving them at the end of the day in order to contribute or communicate to employers? This is what I've done. This is what I can do. This is what I gained from this experience that I had within higher education. So as we see things like AI, for example, come into the workforce and a deep need for training developing for some of these emerging technologies and processes and evolutions that are occurring, I see a consistent challenging of the status quo. One of the roles that I have within my newer position within Colorado is oversight of the state's general education structure. And we are consistently receiving challenges from not only institutions of higher education, but specifically the workforce partners they're engaging with about the requirements for traditional general education programs or curriculum to be included. They're asking, why do I have to pay for this if I'm providing tuition assistance to an individual to complete a course like college algebra? So again, you might think within the construct, how does open once again fit into that equation? Whenever this traditional structure, is being challenged and industry wants to have more of a say in the curriculum of general education, what's the avenue that we all have here to talk about that invites them to come and play in that space? It's open education and OER, perfectly a dovetail fit there. The other thing that you'll hear about frequently within this realm of workforce readiness are framework standards and competencies. Some of these are kind of a merger of work between higher education and industry partners. And one of the examples I've provided there on the screen is the NACE competency, the career readiness framework. But there are others, kind of framework standards, again, and competencies sets that exist independently between higher education and the industry sphere. So we'll talk a little bit more about this here coming up, but how do those things fit together? Again, that Rosetta Stone of translation when we're not using the same language at the end of the day. So as you seek to understand this evolving credential landscape, I'm going to clarify, hopefully, for you all a few of the buzzwords or terms that you see out there, some of which are even used by states and institutions in an interchangeable way, which I slightly disagree with. In some cases, I'll just be completely transparent with you all. So short-term credentials, non-degree credentials, micro-credentials, I largely lump into being the same bucket. And again, in the cases of the changes to short-term Pell funding and the eligibility of those programs, those are the kinds of programs that you're wanting to look at as really anything that's titled under that umbrella. So short-term credentials, obviously that's a connotation of time. So you're thinking about the rapid opportunity for completion there. Non-degree credentials actually include everything related from micro-credentials, nano degrees, certificates, even those kind of traditional structures I would actually lump under that umbrella of non-degree credentials. Micro-credentials, on the other hand, if you actually do a web search and try to find a singular definition of micro-credential, you will never be successful. In the state of Oklahoma, whenever we embarked on this process, we had an amazing council of academic officers that advised the Board of Regents there, who banded together and determined a state level definition for micro-credential programs, which actually ended up being a combination of non-credit or credit-bearing coursework that can add up to 9 credit hours total. So it's an interesting merger of both the credit and non-credit space there, but you can find definitions all the way from the State University of New York, the SUNY system, to Griffith University in Australia. And our council looked at every one of those kinds of sources out there to determine what worked for us. So it is not going to be an apples to apples comparison, but again, you can always kind of safely rely on that short-term non-degree credential framework there. So at this point, I want to inject a couple of kind of provocative ideas into your head, especially as you think about, again, this workforce development ecosystem, short-term credentials, these movements that are happening in particular at the state and national levels. And what is it that we can do in order to consider this alignment between open education and this space? Where does it actually intersect? So as you've heard me mention, there are shifts happening at both the federal, the state, and also the community level with these kinds of programs and new funding opportunities that are coming in all the time. I can tell you all through even the structure that was developed in Oklahoma of the Upskill OK initiative, which was our state level brand for microcredentials. There were towns and communities like the city of Claremore, which is a suburb of Tulsa, that set up community development funds to pay for citizens in their communities to complete these short-term programs that were developed in collaboration with local industry partners. So imagine that kind of cohesion that can be developed even within a singular community. And again, the power that open could have being injected into that conversation to say it's a two-way street of communication between industry partners and faculty in the classroom, perhaps even a three-way street there if you lump students into that conversation as contributors as well. So you might start asking yourself or colleagues around your institution, look at those campus newsletters or state newsletters that are being sent to you about these kind of innovation or initiative updates and see what is going on within my context. What is my institution, for example, doing about the short-term credentialing initiative? Where does it actually live within my institution? Because I'll tell you that varies, having worked with over 25 colleges in the state of Oklahoma to try to set up that kind of infrastructure. Just can't emphasize enough that librarians are key contributors within the conversation as well, and that librarians are industry partners or players in that space at the end of the day. They are experts at curation and being able to locate information that's relevant to a particular given audience there. So do not leave them out of the table at the end of the day. A couple of curriculum examples that you might see that have brought open education into kind of the space of workforce development can include things like capstone courses that might include open industry case studies. So invite industry partners into the classroom, let individuals or the learners in the classroom analyze what's going on within that organization, which can directly provide them with benefit in some cases, depending upon that feedback that's received there. Student contributed curriculum using open principles. So this can mean, for example, that you're working with an industry partner and you get on-the-job training tools from them that are incorporated into your classroom and utilize a platform like Pressbooks, for example, to have your students go in there and critique that and provide suggestions for improvement. Once again, engaging directly with that industry partner to provide that benefit for their business. You might also begin looking for framework alignment opportunities. So Colorado, for example, passed some legislation a couple of years ago that mandated that we align short-term credentials with the United Nations International Standard Classifications for Education Framework, or ISCED framework. So this is something that's globally recognized, allows credentials that are created here to kind of be leveraged and recognized, among peer or equivalent credential type programs around the world. Colorado also has a framework to support quality non-degree credentials, which has a lot of language in there that does align with some of the principles that we try to kind of embody within the open education world here. But above all, one of the things I want you to consider, especially when working in this open ed space and workforce space, is the role that metadata can play. And this is something that we're looking at exploring, especially through the Doers organization. But again, with these frameworks that we're talking about within industry, learning outcomes and competencies, which are directly associated with skills, metadata can be a very useful resource in order to inject open into this space. So you'll have an opportunity to be able to collect artifacts, for example, from employers such as job postings or job descriptions. And you can use that information, including tools like Lightcast Skill Extractor tool, in order to see what are the KSAs that are associated with what is being discussed within this particular document. And once again, connecting that to particular learning resources. I think there's a lot of opportunity as well for organizations like OER Commons to look at those kinds of frameworks and see how do we even index these resources so that they can be as discoverable as possible to this audience that is not usually sitting alongside us in higher ed. So a couple of recommendations for you all for individuals that you might want to connect with: instructional design teams, online learning divisions, continuing ed units. I love land-grant mission institutions because they have a function to get out into the community directly, especially through those extension offices. And your career services colleagues can be great allies within this space to figure out what's emerging, what's going on, where can I go make the case. Among your state and external partners, you can see another list there. Higher ed workforce offices or state higher ed executive offices as well can be a big ally for you. Again, filling you in on that state landscape. Workforce boards and councils, go fill them in on what free open educational resources, openly licensed materials can do for them. Legislative bodies, open education providers, and doers is also a great place that you all can look towards. We've actually been doing work such as issuing surveys out to figure out what's going on in this space right now. Are people leveraging this? How are industry partners and institutions working together?
Awesome. Thank you, Brad. And I just dropped those surveys in the chat. Perfect.
Great, thank
And
you.
it's now going to go back to Nicole.
All right. Oh, apologies. I moved my laptop. So I'm going to close this out with just a couple of final thoughts on advocacy and strategic positioning for advocating for open education on campus. At Spark, we like to say that advocacy is at its core, it's action to influence change. And thinking about all of these different challenges, opportunities, and issues that are presenting themselves in the current environment, and how to strategically position open education within all of those. We have lots of great ideas from Brad and Will, and a couple of pieces of advice. So first, identifying those potential opportunities or ways to integrate open education into institutional priorities. Think about how to develop a strategy to approach that. Like, how does the change you're trying to make get made? Who are the key decision makers? And what can you do to influence them to make that change? Like, what arguments will work? Understanding like what the decision makers' motivations are. Where is the overlap in your goals? How might you work together? How can you make it easy for them to say yes? And in the current environment we're in, some of the ideas for how to connect open education to your institutional priorities include things like reducing the cost of higher education and access barriers for all students, improving student success and retention, advancing strategic priorities or the institution's strategic plan, enhancing academic freedom or innovation at the institution, or fostering collaboration, but both across departments at the institution and also within the classroom. So in terms of thinking about how open education can meet this moment, I think there are lots of ways to just like be creative and think about what the conversations are at your campus and find ways to connect open education into that. So I know we wanted to leave just a little bit of time for questions at the end, and I've seen a lot of great comments in the chat. So Christina, I'm wondering if we can maybe take a couple of questions before we wrap up.
Absolutely. Well, and I know that you, I think maybe answered in the chat, but we were wondering if you could answer it live. The question about OER, Creative Commons, NC, or non-commercial licenses, and how that all works together with an inclusive model.
Yeah, so just I answered a couple of questions. Is this the one about institution? Okay, yeah, sorry. I was looking at the other question. Of course. Yeah, so the question is, there's also a good question about pro OER faculty who are stepping away that is important. I hope you look at too. But this is the question about So I'm using an open resource that has a non-commercial license. My institution has adopted an inclusive access model that charges students a flat fee for every course, regardless of textbook adoption. Is that inclusive model in conflict in some way with the NC license? And the short answer to that is I think it's unlikely that your institution's use of, or an individual faculty member's use of an NC licensed resource would be in violation of the way that the Creative Commons has tended to define non-commerciality. And there's a link in the Q&A and in chat specifically about what they call their non-commercial interpretation resources, that basically asks whether something is being used in a way that isn't primarily devoted toward or intended towards commercial advantage. So I don't think the institution is going to be in any trouble in that space. But I think what it points to is the great point that Nicole started us out with, which is like, we are using open resources to reduce costs, and that should be reflected in the inclusive access model in the first place. So I think that's a really powerful tool to go back and say, hey, we're assigning resources in another way. And in fact, those resources are intended to not be used commercially. So where you can do that negotiation, that would remove any last smidgen of a doubt. But I wouldn't stay up at night worrying about your institution getting sued because you included NC licensed OER, just because your institution has also adopted some sort of automatic billing plan.
Great, thank you.
Thank
And
you.
then the other question was just about faculty who have been pro OER who are concerned about their content being scraped into AI models. Any advice on that?
Yeah, so again, I've got a more fulsome answer in chat, but briefly, the reality today is that most folks who are finding big sets of data to train their models on are doing it in relatively indiscriminate ways, and they're often doing it in ways that are relying on other parts of copyright, like fair use. So the fact that something is openly licensed doesn't make it more pragmatically or probably legally available to be scraped. It probably doesn't change that analysis. What does change is if you don't share it openly, you are cutting off the good actors, the people who you want to be using your stuff, but you're still leaving it available for the bad actors to use it. So you're getting the worst of all worlds if you step back from openness in that way. CC has also recently released this new set of what they call preference signals. These are not legally binding, but these are statements about how you hope the good actors will respect your intentions for the use. So the part of it you can control, which is how the good actors behave, CC has given you some good tools to engage with. But the nature of something being out in the world is that people can see it and engage with it in a lot of different ways.
Thanks,
Really
Will.
good questions, both of those. Thank you, Christina.
Yeah, great questions for everyone. And then Nicole, I think we have time for one. Rachel said she's currently researching how textbook and material costs negatively impact historically marginalized populations. How do you see IA disproportionately impacting them?
That is also a great question. The default nature of automatic textbook billing programs is that they put the burden on those who most need the savings to do the work to opt out in order to achieve those savings. So inherently, it is an anti-equitable model or an anti-fair model for students. And the students with the more financial means or privilege are more likely to know how to work the system on how to opt out or view the extra costs that they might have to pay as simply paying for convenience. So I think the system itself is designed in a way that will disproportionately harm those that are more tend to be more marginalized or less privileged in our systems. So I shared the link by Dr. Nicholas Simon that looks at majors and the cost of flat fee inclusive access programs across those, where higher paying majors are essentially making out better, where lower paying majors tend to have lower course material costs and pay more than they technically owe, whereas the higher paying majors like the STEM courses have higher course material costs, and in that flat fee model end up being the beneficiaries of the higher or disproportionately higher fees being paid by those in lower paying majors. So there's sort of an anti-fair aspect of the models there. And there's also sort of cynical arguments that have been made that these automatic billing programs let students use their financial aid for course materials more easily. And I think it's important to examine how we can reduce friction on students being able to use their financial aid, but simply hiding this as a fee that just gets tacked on to what students are already paying is deeply should be deeply examined, and is very problematic in an environment where the resumption of student loan payments has really put a spotlight on how crippling student debt is for many students right now, and just like all of the stories of people who are owe more than they even took out 10 years later. So we really do need to be thinking about every dollar students are spending, and sort of hiding that is not the right way to do it. So I'm going to stop there. I know we are at time, we are over time, and leave it to Christina to wrap us up.
All good. Thank you, Nicole. And I just want to show everyone that we captured the questions that we didn't get to. We've captured them, so we'll add them to the Padlet and make sure that we address them in the next session. So what is next? September 25th from 2 to 3 p.m. And I believe, Will, you can be there. Brad, you can be there as well, correct? They're both going to be there. So keep throwing your questions in the Padlet. The Padlet link is coming into the chat again. We'll be talking about all these things and more. We thank you for joining us today. It's been a great conversation. Love all the conversation in the chat and people sharing resources with each other. So thanks for being here, and we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. And we hope you all have a great day.